Hello everyone, this is Ao3 podfic, back with another podfic. Today I will be reading The Coral Palace by I Did It for the Lol, and this will be Chapter 12, Undelivered Messages. Let's get right into it. Annabeth wasn't sure how long they sat there waiting for Hermes to return from Atlantis. Surprisingly, the weather had actually improved slightly, now just a heavy drizzle pouring down over the big house. The ocean had even calmed somewhat, waves retreating and winds winding down to what could be described as gusty rather than hurricane-force winds. Annabeth, Nico, Chiron, Rachel, and Apollo sat in mostly silence, though Apollo and Rachel quietly discussed the painting in the corner of the room. The television was on in the next room, and Annabeth could hear reports of massive earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, and more plaguing the waters of the world, starting earlier that morning before she had even been awake. Soon enough, a few more people trickled back into the conference room as counselors had updated campers and began checking in to see what the plan would be moving forwards. Soon, the remaining members of the 7 had returned, as well as Thalia and Phoebe. After informing the Hunters, the Stoll brothers had also made their way back, along with Will, who was now making his way towards his father. "Any word yet?" Jason asked as he sat back down, wincing as he heard another announcement from the TV stating an aftershock had just hit California. Annabeth shook her head, looking over at Will, who was now discussing something with the god of the sun. "I just think it's worth a try," Will said finally, slightly louder. That fully caught the daughter of Athena's attention. "What is it, Will?" Annabeth asked, everyone's attention finally falling on the son of Apollo. Will winced, turning to face her as Apollo shook his head, looking tired and very unlike how she normally saw him. "I was just telling Dad that we've been working with Robert, that brother of ours that arrived a few months ago. He's had some luck with the ability to sight. It gives him a brief glimpse of something he's been concentrating on. It's not a prophecy, only events that are about to occur or have already occurred, but it's a bit tricky for him. It falls a bit under Dad's prophecy domain, so I was hoping maybe he could talk him through it," Will explained, gesturing back towards his father, who looked troubled. "The problem is, Robert hasn't had much success in seeing something that isn't directly related to him. He could perhaps see if the camp will come under attack soon, but being able to figure out what happened to the Atlantean family would be difficult for him to even look for. And I'm not sure what we would find would be appropriate for a child to see," Apollo said firmly, shaking his head. Will frowned. "I mean, he is 13, Dad, and he's seen injuries before. He works in the infirmary with both of us," Will argued, looking frustrated. Apollo shook his head again. "Everything about this is too similar to a story from long ago. If it takes the route it did last time, then that is not something I want any of you to see," Apollo said, voice taking on a desperate edge. His eyes were slightly wild, but his face was stoic. It unnerved Annabeth greatly to see the sun god so tense. He could be intense, of course. Apollo had many domains, and they weren't all sunshine and rainbows. He was the god of prophecy, plague, healing, medicine, and more, but he was normally much more open with his children in discussing their abilities and what might happen if they used them. His children often had a wide variety of his gifts other than archery, and it was always a guessing game for them to narrow down what they had inherited from the sun god. "Are you talking about what happened to Xanth when she was captured before?" Annabeth asked quickly, noting Apollo's wince. "Doctor-patient confidentiality, kid. I was summoned to help heal her after she was out of her bindings, and it wasn't pretty. I don't want Robert to see that. He's barely 13 as it is," Apollo said, somewhat desperate. "But if it could provide us valuable intel on what happened down there, isn't it worth it?" And Robert volunteered. "He's seen bad injuries before, including when a few Ares campers nearly eviscerated themselves falling on that trap of the Hephaestus campers set a few weeks back," Will reminded his father. Annabeth winced this time, remembering the incident clearly. This was before her and Percy had returned to camp, but Malcolm had called to tell her about the incident due to the severity. A few new campers of Hephaestus had been experimenting with medieval traps and had set up one without permission in a section of the woods for Capture the Flag. While the Ares campers, 2 of Clarice's younger brothers, at 12 and 14, had recovered with quick work from the Apollo healers and Chiron himself, traps had since been much more restricted for any war games the campers wanted to play. Apollo shook his head quickly in response, looking troubled. "Look, I can't tell you much, but let's just say it was worse than that," Apollo said darkly. Annabeth tensed at the tone. What in the world had possibly happened that had been worse than anything they had seen? Annabeth frowned harder. "Then what can we do?" the daughter of Athena asked in reply. Our sister Michelle has been working more on her abilities," Travis called out. Everyone turned to face the son of Hermes. "She got more of the messenger side of skills. She's been able to recall messages that have been sent in the past. She manages to write out the exact message the Titanic sent out right before it sank the other day, in Morse code. And she had never even seen it before," Travis explained. Everyone glanced back towards Annabeth. "I remember that one well," Come quick, engine room nearly full. A voice called from behind them, heads whipping around and revealing Hermes walking into the conference room. Would it be possible, then, to see if they tried to send a message that didn't go through? Annabeth asked the messenger god, who shrugged. I'd say it could be worth a shot. Boys, would you mind grabbing your sister for me? Hermes asked. Travis and Connor nodded before making their way back towards the Hermes cabin. Annabeth shot Hermes a glance. Wait, if you're here, why can't you do it? Jason asked, looking thoughtfully over at Hermes, who shook his head. My children inherit more of an interpretation of my gifts rather than the entire gift itself. There are a lot of ways my messenger skills can manifest in them. Sometimes they're just really good at delivering messages at the right moment, or knowing if someone has an important message to give someone. Michelle is able to recall messages that were supposed to be delivered but never arrived alongside messages that were delivered in the past. Because my domain is so broad, it can be difficult for me to filter through the chatter. She'll be able to focus on that while I guide her power to actually pull an answer through to us. Hermes explained, shaking his head slightly. Annabeth nodded. It did make sense. Percy had noticed that certain aspects he wasn't the most skilled in from his father's domain, such as his Earthshaker abilities, had begun to improve and receive some sort of boost when his father was nearby. Annabeth also found working in one of her mother's temples on Olympus had seriously accelerated her ability to work on plans for reconstructing the home of the gods after the Titan War. Does Poseidon know about Percy? Annabeth asked quickly. Hermes' face twisted into a frown, eyes glancing towards the doorway. Annabeth followed his gaze and suddenly spotted the Lord of the Seas standing by the window in the hallway, looking out over the water with a thunderous expression. He was dressed in bronze armor, his trident strapped against his back. He was in a black protrudes and black leather sandals that wrapped around his calves. His hair was long and pulled back into a low ponytail. His armor had a large trident engraved in gold in the breastplate, and on his salt and pepper hair sat a crown of fishbone, pearls, aquamarine, and coral set into celestial bronze. His jaw was set with displeasure, body tense. He looked ancient, like a version of himself that Annabeth had never seen before. His beard was surprisingly short cut around his jaw, and streaks of gray intermingled with the black. His hands were clenched by his sides, fingertips seemingly having inhuman claws at the ends that flicked slightly in form as Annabeth tried to look more closely. His mortal form always appeared tall, though now he seemed particularly intimidating at nearly 7 feet in height. He would almost have to duck to get through the doorway. Broad, tan shoulders were tense, green eyes looking quietly at the rain pouring down around them, rage practically flowing off him, his aura pulsing with his emotions. I do, the Lord of Horses said, his voice bordering on inhuman rage. The other demigods in Chiron quickly stood, bowing and offering quiet greetings to Poseidon. Do you think what we are saying will work, Hermes? The Lord of the Seas asked, finally turning to face the room, his gaze burning into Hermes' thoughtful expression. It's worth a shot, especially since you're here. If the message was meant for you, then she might have an easier time concentrating on the message that was trying to be sent, Hermes replied, cocking his head slightly as he thought. Poseidon nodded darkly, walking slowly into the room and stopping near Chiron. My lord, campus prepared in case of an all-out assault. Is road prepared in case our younger campers need to evacuate? Chiron asked the Lord of the Seas, who nodded. The escape pendants she gave you have been rerouted to take them into Atlantis safely. Rode, Ben, and Triton are currently on lockdown in the palace with their mother. I will not be allowing them out of our sight for the time being. The sea god said, rage filtering through his tone. Annabeth winced slightly before speaking. Is it possible they could be rerouted, my lord? Percy was intending to come and see you and never made it, Annabeth asked, her gaze meeting that of the sea lord's. He seemed to soften slightly as he met her expression, taking in her frazzled and anxious appearance. I will ensure personally that they are not. If you send anyone away, contact me immediately. Hermes has assured me that there will be no more interference in our messages. Poseidon said darkly. Hermes nodded as the others looked towards him to confirm. And Triton, being the messenger of the seas, will make it easier for him to get through to me if you believe the spells are being put back up. Now that he knows what he is looking for, he'll be able to sense it. Hermes added. Poseidon nodded firmly. Travis and Connor quickly returned, Michelle following behind them with a shocked expression. They quickly guided her past the intense stare from Poseidon to stand near Hermes, and the 15-year-old looked up at her father with a stunned expression. I don't know how to look for a message that hasn't been delivered for someone I hardly know about, Michelle said after a moment, looking around at all of them anxiously. She was a shorter girl with mouse-brown hair and blue eyes. She was shivering slightly, her camp shirt and jeans soaked through with the rain. Hermes smiled softly at her, placing his fingers under her chin so she had to look at him. Hey, it's okay. I'll be here to help guide you and make sure we can find what we're looking for, since I know more about them than you. If we can't, then no biggie. We're right here. We're right where we were before. Hermes reassured her. Poseidon scowled at the idea of can't, but said nothing. He schooled his expression back into a frown as Michelle glanced at him, and he nodded. Okay, I normally have to write these things down, the daughter of Hermes said after a moment, glancing back towards her father. Apollo stepped forwards, shaking his head. If Hermes lets me tap in a bit while you work, then I may be able to create a vision of the message rather than having to write it down, Apollo explained. Hermes nodded his approval at his older brother. Together, the two gods sat down. Michelle, standing between them, Hermes reached out and took her right hand, and Apollo grasped her left. She looked decidedly anxious, but then took a deep breath and schooled her expression. She closed her eyes, and her brows furrowed with concentration. Hermes watched her closely. Apollo closed his eyes as well, holding his open hand out in front of him. Let's start with Percy, Hermes said softly. Michelle nodding at the words. The room was dead silent for a moment before an image flickered to life above Apollo's open hand. It was an image of dark, murky water, barely any light visible in the image. Suddenly, something moved into frame, the image of someone swimming upwards through the water. Annabeth's heart pounded as she recognized Percy, as the image moved closer, his green eyes staring around him in confusion. Poseidon leaned in expectantly, eyes locked on the image of his only demigod son. Small whispers broke out around the other campers, eyes drawn to the expression of confusion written on Percy's face. He glanced around and then closed his eyes. Despite his lips never moving, a familiar voice rang out around the room. Dad, Triton, I'm not sure where I am. Are you close? Percy asked, eyes opening after another moment and looking around again. Poseidon let out a sharp breath between his teeth. Annabeth's heart beat hard against her ribcage. They had discovered at a young age Percy had perfect bearings at sea. The second his skin touched the water, he knew precisely where he was and how to get where he was going. For him to not know where he was while submerged in the depths of his father's domain was unnerving. The image started to dissipate, like mist falling back into a puddle. Suddenly, Michelle let out a small, curious noise, cocking her head while her eyes remained closed. What is it? Hermes asked quickly, scanning his daughter for signs of discomfort. Michelle opened her mouth to speak again. There's more. Another message undelivered, the daughter of Hermes said determinedly, furrowing her brow in concentration once more. Annabeth sat up straighter, everyone leaning in slightly as the image in front of them began to reappear in a cloud of mist. Annabeth gasped as a new image came into view, one of Percy gasping in front of them. He was on his knees and looked gravely injured. His body was covered in cuts and black and purple bruises, his leg bleeding into the water behind him. The way he had shifted his weight off his right side was indicative of broken ribs, alongside the fact that his breath seemed shallow in spite of his struggle. The most startling part about the image was the silver chains that were wrapped around him, pulling his arms taut and out to his sides. His face was an expression of panic and desperation she hadn't seen since they had fallen into the pit, green eyes alight with horror. He was blinking rapidly, head dropping down towards his chest as his body started to go lax. Tell Annabeth I'm sorry, Percy's voice finally said, his lips unmoving. The image went dark as Percy slumped towards the sea floor, dissipating into mist as Apollo closed his hand. Poseidon let out a fierce and inhuman growl, the earth shaking suddenly beneath them before stilling just as quickly. Annabeth felt tears start to well in her eyes as she quickly slammed them shut. Of course, when he was injured, chained, and bleeding, his first thoughts were to tell her he was sorry for breaking his promise to not go off and get himself hurt. It was so like him, a painful throb in her heart as she took a deep and shaky breath. She finally managed to pull her eyes open and tune in the chatter around them. Everyone was muttering in hushed tones, glancing between the godly beings in the room and Annabeth. A quick glance revealed that this had only further enraged the god of the seas, whose eyes had started glowing a faint green-blue as his expression only darkened. His eyes were alight with rage, and Annabeth felt if she looked directly into them, she would be driven insane with visions of storms and destruction of the past. Carwin glanced worriedly at her before her attention was drawn to Hermes, who was patting Michelle's hand gently as she stared worriedly over at the god of the seas. I'm sorry, that's all there was, Michelle said, voice shaking slightly as she addressed Percy's father. The Lord of the Sea shook his head. You have done well. I understand you have limitations. Are you able to repeat this with my daughters? Poseidon asked, voice barely disguising rage as he spoke, in a surprisingly gentle tone towards the girl. The stories spoke often about Poseidon's wrath, but Annabeth knew he had a gentler side to him, especially when it came to children, and even those who weren't his own. He was never unkind to any demigod at camp when he came to visit Percy, and oftentimes would speak with the other children if they approached him while he was present. Unless someone was outright disrespectful, Annabeth didn't know if she'd ever seen the sea god so much as raise his voice. Apart from council meetings with Zeus, the two brothers had a tendency to dissolve into shouting matches while Hades watched on in exasperation. Michelle nodded slowly and glanced back towards Hermes. The messenger god nodded back at her reassuringly, and she closed her eyes again. She swallowed as Apollo held his hand open once more, the sun god closing his eyes as well. Okay, Chemopolia this time, Hermes continued. Michelle took a deep breath, and slowly an image appeared over Apollo's open hand. The image took form into the shape of the goddess of storms, dressed for combat in the depiction before them. She was in full bronze armor, though she was in merwoman's form. Her scales were deep purple and blue, a gradient across her limbs. Her fingers were clawed and black as night, her lips bared in a vicious snarl of shark teeth across her fury-written face. Her crown was no longer a simple circuit, but instead made of celestial bronze with massive shark teeth embedded around the base of the crown. The image of the breaking ship was sat in the center, and Kim clutched a glowing bronze sword in her hands that Annabeth half-mindedly realized was a falcata. She was staring past them, rage filling her eyes as an inhuman growl rang out. I don't know why you cannot hear me, but something is coming. My palace will fall, but I will not stand aside when my generals are slaughtered. I am weak. I have been poisoned. I am unsure why the water does not heal me. Chemopolia's voice said darkly. She did look slightly unwell. There were dark circles under her eyes, and a few smaller cuts along her arms were bleeding sluggishly, despite having been submerged in the depths. Annabeth's breath caught in her throat at the mention of poison, feeling like ice sending a shudder through her body. Her mind sent flashes of the pit, of Percy's desperate face, of fire scalding her throat, glassed against her feet. She gasped softly and shut her eyes for a moment before looking back to the still-glowing image. You'd better come find me soon, Chemopolia's voice said, though her lips never moved. A roar sounded in the distance as the image began to fade, before suddenly solidifying into a new form. Poseidon let out a snarl as gasps echoed across the room. When the new image came fully into focus, Chemopolia had been transformed back into a semi-human form. She had 2 legs again, and her skin was bruised purple and gold, bleeding from various small cuts. She had scales around her shoulders in dark purple and blue, and though she had a human face, her teeth were sharp and pointed. She snarled at the figure above her, a shadowed-looking being with glowing white eyes far above the sea goddess. Clawed hands reached down, pulling Kim's crown from her head and letting out a cruel laugh. Chemopolia's clothing had changed to a simple white tunic clasped around her shoulders, falling to just above her knees. She was wrapped in silver chains around her shoulders down to her wrists, inscribed with black sigils that seemed to almost be pulling in shadows from around them. The chains tightened as Chemopolia's eyes began to glow solid gold. The goddess opened her mouth and letting out one final bellow before the image cut off. It was a language that Annabeth couldn't understand, but she managed to make out how it sounded as Makataka. What did she say? Connor asked quietly, looking at his father. Hermes winced and glanced over at Poseidon, who was seething. The winds outside had picked up again. The sea god looked as though he was attempting to soothe his temper. She called for her mother and I, Poseidon said darkly, face drawn in tempered rage. Michelle swallowed hard and glanced out at Hermes, who smiled softly at her in reassurance. You did well, the messenger god soothed. Let's try Xanth next. Concentrate on what you know about her, and let me guide you towards what we're looking for, Hermes said, Michelle taking another deep breath as he spoke. It took longer than the previous time, but soon an image began to appear above Apollo's open hand. Xanth's eyes stared back at them as the image moved out, seemingly looking through all of them as something behind the image. She was in full armor, the soft glow of a massive coral palace lit by glowing pearls behind her. She looked uneasy, face furrowed into a frown as she kept her gaze steady. Finally, a voice rang out, Xanth's familiar tone echoing through the room. Pateras, something approaches. It feels old and powerful. My messengers tell me they cannot get any messages through to you. I cannot feel you. I cannot leave the city boundaries. Something has poisoned me. I'm not healing well. The goddess finally spoke. She did look rather ill. Her eyes had dark circles under them, and a large gash along her collarbone from some sort of blade had split her open. Golden ichor poured from the wound, and part of her breastplate had caved in at the blow. Annabeth's heart pounded harder at the second mention of poison. Something is coming and I cannot reach you. I must face it. Forgive me, Xanth finally said, lips moving as she spoke. Annabeth could feel intent rolling off the words, similar to when Percy spoke aloud to his siblings despite actually reaching out with his mind. A quick glance at Poseidon revealed an expression that had twisted into one of both fury and something akin to guilt. He didn't speak, instead taking in every second of the image as it slowly started to dissolve in Apollo's hand. Is that all? Hermes asked, the god still completely focused on his daughter. The 15-year-old didn't respond. Instead, the image changed and solidified in Apollo's hand. They all refocused on it, scanning for bits of information they could possibly pull out from the image sat before them. It cut to a new scene, this one much louder than the previous one. As the image came into focus, Annabeth could hear chanting in an old and powerful language, quietly filling the room with unease. The voice felt cold and cruel, and as the image took final form, Annabeth let out a soft gasp. It was very nearly the image Rachel had painted and revealed to them the night before, Xanth being pulled to her knees by a glowing silver chain inscribed with black writing. The voices chanting got louder, and Annabeth could hear the screams of soldiers clashing with monsters in the background. The being above Xanth was no easier to see, still shadowed and monstrous in size. Xanth struggled against the chains, letting out a desperate scream as she lashed against the chains. It only renewed the golden ichor pouring down her arms. Her appearance was now her in a simple white chiton clasped over her shoulders and stopping just above her knees. Unlike the image Rachel had painted, the tunic was only smeared with her godly blood, while most of it floated off into the water surrounding them. Xanth opened her mouth, eyes starting to glow gold as tears of ichor began to run down her face. Voiathisteme! Den su telefonisa prin. Alla su telefono tora! Se palakalo patera! The goddess of tsunami shouted upwards, voice breaking with a desperate sob on the last syllable. With those final words, the goddess went slack in her chains, eyes falling shut and body going limp. Her head began to fall towards the sea floor, but a clawed hand reached out and grabbed a handful of her blonde hair and yanked her head back. Xanth's eyes remained closed as the image began to fall away into a spray of mist. That's all there is, Michelle said, eyes still closed. Suddenly, Apollo shook his head, the image beginning to pull back up. No, keep concentrating. This is part of the prophecy. May be able to loophole our way into seeing some of it through your abilities. The sun god quickly explained, Michelle nodding as the image focused entirely. Annabeth nearly choked as the image reformed. A familiar figure stood holding Xanth's limp form with a clawed hand, tattered black dress, sunken eyes, blood-stained cheeks, and rowdy hair. Annabeth's breaths came faster, eyes widening in horror and at the abrupt and unexpected reminder of the pit. She took longer to fall than I expected from your poison, my sister. The voice called, another figure stepping into view. It was the goddess Percy had described from his dreams the other night. Eris. The goddess was now in armor, black as night, and carrying a sharp dagger in her hands. Her fingers were clawed as well as she reached down and clasped Xanth's cheek harshly with her hand. Nails dug into flesh, but Xanth didn't so much as flinch. Blasted sea blood, the rowdy goddess's cold voice said in reply. Even his bastards have too much control over a domain that isn't theirs, especially the damned boy. Annabeth's breath caught in her throat, eyes growing wider. Her mind refused to say the name, still processing what she was seeing before her. Yes, I know all about your hate for that demigod. We'll get him soon enough. Eris replied smoothly, dropping Xanth's face and standing to face the goddess next to her. I still do not see why we could not go for him first, the rowdy goddess muttered, eyes dark with rage. Eris shook her head, looking annoyed. It is how our new friend needs it done. It is more difficult to hide the demigod's disappearance at this point. Our spells will hold here longer so we can conserve our resources. We'll bring himself to us before long. Eris snapped back, suddenly turning towards the battlefield behind them with a cruel smile. I wish to bathe in the blood of this battle now, dear sister. Take that one away and go make her downright miserable, Eris said, waving her hand behind her, the other goddess. The words struck Annabeth like a bullet, her mind flashing to an image of Percy's face, so cold, so cruel. She didn't even know he could look so cold, the goddess choking on her own poison. The image began to fall away as Xanth was pulled away in a wash of sickly black water, floating away outwards from the goddess of misery. Her mind raced as she tried to keep herself present, but she was almost trapped in a field of memories she couldn't fight. Poseidon looked enraged. The ground quaked slightly, but the god had not allowed it to shake more than a slight tremble. The winds outside raged, but were already seeming to calm. Annabeth took a shaking breath as Hazel suddenly noticed her appearance. Annabeth, are you okay? What's wrong? The daughter of Pluto noticed from a few chairs down, standing and moving towards the daughter of Athena. This brought a few other people's notice, and Annabeth heaved in another gasp, mind still racing. Achilles, Annabeth managed to wheeze out, before suddenly realizing she couldn't be in that room anymore. She jumped to her feet, racing out towards the Poseidon cabin. She heard people shouting after her as she ran. A long time ago, she would even be embarrassed at the scene she had just caused. But now she knew that getting away from everyone was more important. The rain seemed to part around her, but she only noticed as an afterthought. Her feet slammed into the earth as she ran, breath coming in rapid gasps. Tears started rolling down her face as she remembered Percy, broken, bleeding, crying for her, clutching her hand in his. Finally, she reached the door to cabin 3, slammed into it, and raced inside. She ran for the bathroom, desperate to lock herself away where she felt like nothing could get inside. She slammed the door and slid the lock into place before collapsing onto the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and squeezed her eyes shut. She braced herself against the door. She tried to breathe through her panic. Before she shut her eyes, her vision had been spotty, and still, even she could hear Percy screaming for her in her mind. She could hear herself, too, desperately calling for Percy while blind and deaf, not able to feel him anywhere around her. She sobbed, burying her head in her knees as she tried to stop gasping. She felt so weak when this happened. She knew it wasn't a weakness, not really. She knew this was expected, that they had been through a lot, but every time she broke down, she felt like a failure. Things got better with time, but a direct reminder of one of the worst things she had ever experienced, coupled with Percy being taken, had wreaked havoc on Annabeth's emotions. A few minutes later, she had managed to slow her breathing and heart rate slightly, still unable to move as her sobs subsided. She took another deep breath and jumped suddenly as a soft knock on the other side of the door. "Annabeth?" a voice called, oddly familiar. Annabeth frowned, wiping her face and coughing slightly to clear her throat. "What?" she called weakly. She heard shuffling for a moment before the voice continued. "Would you be able to come out, or could I come in?" A voice called through the door. Annabeth suddenly realized it was Apollo calling from outside. She blinked for a moment and finished wiping her face, somewhat clear of her tears. "I'll come out," Annabeth said in reply, pulling herself to her feet. She splashed a little water on her face, frowning at how red her eyes looked before she pulled open the door, and was slightly stunned to find not only Apollo, but also Poseidon and Hermes standing further back in the cabin. "We need to ask how you know Achilles," Apollo told her slowly, looking her over briefly. Annabeth swallowed hard, glancing at the ground. "It's something me and Percy never wanted to talk about," she said softly, voice nearly breaking. Apollo nodded at her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It seems like now it's going to be important that we have all the facts," the sun god said. Annabeth nodded slowly. "I know. I need to sit down," the daughter of Athena said, moving around Apollo towards where she and Percy had 2 beds pushed together. She sat down, pulling Percy's pillow closer to her chest so she could try and catch the scent of his favorite shampoo he used. "Where did you meet her, child?" Poseidon said softly, eyes seemingly calm for a moment, though Annabeth knew that was likely to not freak her out. Annabeth took a deep breath as the 3 gods moved around her. Apollo sat down on a neighboring unused bed, and Hermes conjured a folding chair to sit down on. Poseidon remained standing near the door, now dressed in his usual Hawaiian shirt and Bermuda shorts. "The pit," Annabeth said after a moment. All 3 gods shuddered at the mention of the place. "We needed her death mist. It was the only way to make it to the doors unnoticed," she started to explain, glancing down at the pillow still clutched in her lap. The gods exchanged glances, Poseidon looking back to her face closely. "We were so tired. We knew she would betray us, but we had to try, see if we could outsmart her," Annabeth continued, not able to turn her head up yet. She swallowed thickly, shaking her head. "And betray she did. She tried to kill us, drown us in her poison. We couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. And then suddenly I could again." She stopped, not sure how to continue. "And then?" Apollo asked softly after another moment. Annabeth took a deep breath, waiting another beat before opening her mouth again. "Percy was choking her on her own poison," she finally said. It felt strange to say it to anyone else. She'd always known that if it wasn't life or death, this was something she and Percy wanted to keep between them. It had taken weeks for them to even broach the subject with each other. Annabeth had sobbed to Percy how sorry she was for her initial reaction. She was scared when it had first happened, but her emotions were also completely fried. She had been on the verge of death for days. They were exhausted and nearly ready to give up, though neither of them would have admitted it at the time. They kept going for each other and nothing else. They had spent several days discussing everything that happened with their therapists, and they had come to accept what had happened, though Percy had still been resolved to never use that ability again. She had always known that he would never hurt her, and he had only done it to keep her safe. She looked up to see Hermes and Apollo exchanging glances with somewhat shocked expressions, and spotted Poseidon nodding sagely. "It does not surprise me. He is not the first child of mine to exhibit control of other liquid substances in extreme circumstances," the Lord of the Seas said softly. Annabeth's eyes shot open wider. "Really?" she asked. They had been worried it was an effect of the pit, and now Annabeth wished she had pushed Percy to speak with his father about the topic earlier. Poseidon nodded in reply. "It would explain why she would agree to stand against you. Those two children of Nyx are typically very focused on one goal when they get together," Hermes commented after a beat, looking over at his uncle, who scowled. "It seems this new friend they mentioned may be the true mastermind behind this plan," Poseidon said darkly, looking out towards the stormy water. "What could disguise itself enough that you can't recognize it?" Annabeth asked quietly, glancing up at her boyfriend's father. Poseidon shook his head. "Not much, typically something old and belonging to the seas," the sea god said, looking back towards her. "What do we do now?" Annabeth asked after another moment. Poseidon's expression darkened, and he looked towards his nephew. Apollo and Hermes stood. "Alert your father as to what has happened. As of now, Atlantis is officially at war. If I find out anyone is withholding information about what has happened to my children, they are standing against me, and I consider that an act of betrayal. I will return to Atlantis to continue fighting and begin the search for them," the god of the seas said coldly, Hermes nodding and disappearing into thin air. "Uncle, contact me if anything occurs and you're in need of a healer, especially if the situation is anything like last time," Apollo said softly, nodding to the Lord of Horses and disappearing with the scent of flowers and of hot asphalt warmed by the sun. Poseidon was left alone with Annabeth, scowling at the reminder. Annabeth looked at the god, now needing to know. "What happened last time that was so terrible?" Annabeth asked. "We know she was tortured, but Apollo says it's bad enough he doesn't want any of his children to see it." Annabeth's voice nearly shook. If it had happened like that last time, what was to say it wouldn't happen to Percy now? Would he be able to recover? What should she expect to find when they brought him home? Because there was no way in any hell that she wasn't bringing him home, not after everything they'd been through. The god of the seas tensed, jaw clenched as he glanced back her direction. He shook his head before he spoke. "It is not my place to tell you that. I can assure you that what happened to Xanth cannot happen the same way to Percy. That is a much more complicated story than her imprisonment alone," the Lord of the Seas said, his tone not doing much to reassure Annabeth. She nodded, though was not entirely pleased with the answer. Something suddenly dawned on her, and she reached quickly for her phone. "I need to tell Sally and Paul," Annabeth said, trying to open her contacts. Poseidon shook his head at her. Poseidon looked her over briefly before moving slowly towards the door. "I will tell her myself now. I'll return later to discuss any possible findings. Contact me if anything changes," the sea god said, disappearing with the roar of a sea storm and a crashing wave. Annabeth took a shaky breath before soothing her expression. She stood and headed back towards the big house. She needed to check in with the others and figure out what the plan was from the camp's perspective. Sally Jackson Blowfist awoke to find the world shaking around her. Picture frames clattered off the wall in her bedroom, and she felt Paul jolt awake next to her. Her heart started pounding as she threw back her cream-colored comforter and leapt to her feet, racing down the hall with her husband on her heels. Estelle slept in the room next to them in their three-bedroom house. Paul and Sally had bought shortly after their child was born. It was a quaint place in the suburbs, not terribly far from Montauk, and Percy had been overjoyed to discover they had managed to move outside of the city when he returned from the Giant War. Sally knew the life of a demigod would be dangerous before Percy was ever born. She thought she had seen him through the worst of it, that he had survived insurmountable odds and lived past his 16th birthday. He had turned down immortality to remain with his girlfriend and family for the rest of his life. He had gone back to school, and with Annabeth's help maintained decent grades and started branching out more at school after he successfully toppled the Titan Lord. Late that November, Sally had discovered she was pregnant with Estelle. At first, Sally was worried about how Percy would react, terrified her child would think she was attempting to replace him. Instead, Percy had been absolutely overjoyed, already begging her to let him help get the nursery ready and deciding on what stories he could tell his new sibling from the myths of his godly family. Sally had been so overwhelmed with joy and love from her son, it had nearly brought her to tears. Sometimes she wondered how she had gotten so lucky with the boy she had raised. The next day, Percy went off to camp to visit his friends in Annabeth, there visiting before she would return to California and school with her father. She had been thrilled to share the news with her permission, of course, and had gladly announced to the entire camp that he was to be a big brother for the second time. Percy never forgot about Tyson, and the boys visited each other at camp often. Sometimes she would come home from the publisher's office to find Tyson sitting cheerfully in the living room, him and Percy attempting to play some sort of video game. She'd always loved having the young Cyclops in her home, and she knew it made Poseidon happy when his children got along. It was a few days later that Sally got a call from Annabeth. The worst news she'd ever heard in her life passed through the phone, the demigod daughter of Athena's voice distraught. "Sally, we can't find him. Percy's disappeared." The following months were the hardest in her entire life, and considering what she had endured in the years of her previous marriage, that said a lot. Not knowing where Percy was had crushed her. She found herself in a daze. She forced herself to be strong. For her son. She had to be strong. She knew she would find his way home to her. Sally could feel it. Finally, she received word that something had changed, that they may have a lead where Percy had gone. 3 demigods, Jason, Piper, and Leo, as she would later learn, had made a sudden appearance. Jason, a Roman demigod that had his memory wiped by the Queen of the Gods. They believed the boys had been switched, forcing them to bring the campers together. Still, though, there was no word on where Percy was. Then, suddenly, it was June. Sally, now 8 months pregnant, was having an incredibly difficult pregnancy. She had terrible morning sickness, high blood pressure, and more. Her doctors were in a frazzle trying to make sure she was healthy and able to carry the baby to term. She still held strong. She just had to wait. Her boy would come home to her. Percy would fight empires to come meet his little sister. She tried not to think about the fact that he didn't know So was a girl when he had been taken. The one morning she got up and found 2 voicemails waiting for her. The first was just a publisher calling to ask for an update for her most recent work she had started prior to Percy's disappearance. But the second one had left her in tears. "Hey, Mom. Hey, I'm alive." She had desperately hit redial on the number, but the phone rang and never picked up. Paul had found her a few minutes later, desperately calling Annabeth on her cell to let her listen to the message her son had finally given them. A few weeks later, they set off for the Roman camp, Annabeth promising to keep in touch with updates, and then she heard nothing for weeks. Soon, it was early July, and Sally was rapidly approaching her due date. Her profession had taken off in a way she hadn't expected, and her books had sold enough that she and Paul were able to put down a deposit on a house. They had carefully packed all of Percy's belongings and arranged them for him in the new room. Sally had Paul paint it sea blue. Sally stayed strong as they decorated the nursery. She tried not to cry when she realized Percy hadn't been able to pick anything out with her like he had wanted to. Then, finally, she went into labor. It was Poseidon who sent her into labor, oddly enough. She woke up that morning to the earth shaking beneath her, a moderate earthquake that had later revealed to be a 5.5 on the Richter scale. Thankfully, their house was unharmed, but it was only a few minutes later there had been a knock on the door. Paul opened the door to find the Lord of the Seas, form practically flickering, with a grim expression on his face. Sally had sobbed when he came around the corner, suddenly tensing as she felt something in her stomach bear down. "What happened to my son?" Sally had asked, Paul racing to her side as she nearly doubled over. There were very few reasons the Earthshaker's powers would rock New York, and the last time it had happened was when Poseidon had been told his son had been taken. Poseidon had looked distressed, glancing down where water had spread down her thighs, before he finally answered. He told her their son wasn't dead, but he had fallen into Tartarus, the pit. Sally had sobbed at the news, Paul desperately packing the car to get her to the hospital. Poseidon had sat with her, eyes concentrated as she cried. Finally, they arrived at the hospital, the doctors rushing to get everything in place. Estelle had come quickly, and, thankfully, without much fuss, as Sally had found herself exhausted. Poseidon had left when they got into the car, and Paul held her hand with teary eyes while their daughter was born. Sally was distraught. One of the best days of her life, coupled with one of the worst. Her son was in literal hell, trapped while she could do nothing. He had missed the birth of his precious little sister, and he didn't even know it. She had cried and clutched Estelle close in her arms while Paul hugged him. A few weeks after that, there was a knock at the door, and her son was standing before her. He was battered, bruised, and looking hauntingly thin, but he was there. She had crushed him in her arms, pulling a haunted-looking Annabeth in with them. They had cried together for a while her son told her a quick summary of everything that had happened. And then Estelle started to cry. She had seen the look on Percy's face, his eyes going wide with shock and guilt. She had smiled at him. "Come meet your little sister," she had told him gently. Percy had cried softly when Estelle was placed carefully in his arms, looking desperately up at his mother. "I have a sister?" he had asked, a spark of joy lighting his face. He had truly become the best big brother ever, overcoming so many challenges to be there for his newborn sister. Her poor son was so broken, so exhausted. He had woken every night for weeks with violent screams, begging for Annabeth through broken sobs. Sally had wept for her boy and watched on with pride as he accepted and learned from the help that was finally given to him. She cheered with him when he got to New Rome University and had driven with him across the country to move him into his apartment with Annabeth. She was so proud of the man her son had become. Those few years of relative peace, Percy had started to meet his older siblings as well, Road even making several appearances at her home. Even Triton once had been by to introduce himself, and Sally had been shocked to discover Ben Thistlecone playing with Percy and Estelle on the beach in Montauk one afternoon. Even Poseidon had come around a few more times. It felt oddly like true co-parenting, Poseidon asking her permission to have Percy around Atlantis for the holidays and things of that sort. She had been lulled, she supposed, into a sense of peace, which brought her to today. Estelle was rapidly approaching her second birthday, and she knew that something had been going on at camp. Percy had mentioned he would still be home on July 5th for Estelle's birthday party, but had been unsure on if he could stay any longer. She had told Sally about his newest godly sister, Xanth, and about the conflict beginning under the sea. Sally was worried, but she had to trust her son would come home. He promised her he would always do everything to come home. But now the earth shook underneath her. She flew into Estelle's room, which they had painted a light blue. Percy had been thrilled at this revelation, but oddly enough, everything seemed much too calm in there. Estelle slept soundly in her crib, her dark brown curls messy around her head. She was in her Nemo pajamas, which Percy had proudly picked out for her while at the store one day, and didn't seem disturbed at all by the earthquake going on. A quick glance around the room as Paul came to a halt next to her was that nothing in this room was shaking. A look back towards the hallway showed the pictures still shaking in their frames, but here they were still. Well, that's odd, Paul finally said, looking around the room and back towards Sally. She moved closer towards the bed, checking once more that her daughter was unharmed, and then looked out the window. A torrential downpour went on outside, and soon enough the hallway outside stopped shaking as well. Deciding to let Estelle sleep, Sally and Paul quietly stepped outside towards the living room. "What in the world was that?" Paul finally asked. Sally quickly moved to where her phone was plugged in. She yanked it up, scanning her phone but not seeing any messages. She pulled up Percy's contact and started calling, the phone ringing before shortly going to voicemail. She nearly yelled as understanding dawned on her husband's face. "He's not answering," Sally said, pulling up her texts and sending rapid ones to Percy, asking where he was and what had happened. She waited another moment in heavy silence with Paul, but did not get a response. "Try to call camp," Paul said suddenly, pulling her over to sit down on the couch. Sally nodded numbly and started calling the number she had saved for Camp Half-Blood. It rang and went to voicemail. She cursed, dropping her phone and running her hands through her hair. "Why aren't they picking up?" Sally asked desperately. Paul taking her hands as he sat down next to her. She leaned against him, eyes welling with tears as he shook his head. "Give them some time. We'll call them again if we don't hear back," Paul soothed. Sally nodded against him. If something had just happened, Percy could be in the middle of battle. Hopefully soon they would have more answers. But why then would her son's father be so angry? She frowned, closing her eyes and sending out a small prayer towards her ex-lover. "What happened to our son, Poseidon?" she asked, but did not receive a response. They sat there another hour before Estelle woke up, babbling from the other room. Paul had gotten up to get her dressed, Sally moving numbly towards the kitchen to get her daughter's breakfast ready. After feeding Estelle and cleaning up, Sally suddenly saw her phone light up on the counter. She had raced towards it, snatching it up to see a text with Percy's contact lighting up her screen. Relief poured into her body as she opened the message, but it only lasted for a brief second before a cold feeling swept her body, and she frowned. "Hey, Mom, I'm all right. Tell Dad to relax. Just having a family reunion of sorts." The message read. "What's wrong?" Paul asked quickly, picking Estelle up. Sally shook her head, not sure what to think of the message. "Percy texted me, but something doesn't sound right here," Sally said slowly. Paul frowned and moved to put Estelle in a playpen in the living room, putting on Dora for her to watch so they could talk for a minute. Paul read the message too, brow furrowing. "You're right. It doesn't really sound like something he would say to you right now," Paul said after a moment, looking back up at her. A pit of worry grew in her stomach, and she took a shaky breath. They sat for a moment before suddenly there was a knock on their front door. Sally froze, Paul's eyes widening as he moved to answer it. Sally's heart thumped against her chest as Poseidon came into view, dressed in his usual Hawaiian shirt combo. He had a grim expression on his face, his eyes dark and stormy. "Not again," Sally said to him desperately, and Poseidon shook his head. "The story is even more complicated this time. I need to fill you both in," Poseidon said, and Sally gestured to the kitchen table. Together, the two stunned mortals and the god of the sea sat down, Poseidon shifting uncomfortably. "What happened to our son?" Sally asked him firmly, eyes boring into him. Poseidon's expression darkened. "3 of my children have now been taken, Percy included," Poseidon told him. Paul's eyes widened. "Who took them?" Sally asked in reply, searching the god's expression. He scowled. "So far we have identified 2 individuals involved, Achilles, goddess of misery and poison, and her sister, Eris, goddess of strife and discord," the Lord of the Seas said. "However, there's another unknown entity in play, an older sea deity I have been unable to identify. I'm not sure why, but they are targeting my children. Xanth was taken first nearly 3 days ago, and Campolia late sometime 2 days ago or so. By our account, Percy was taken sometime last night." Poseidon finished grimly. "Last night?" Sally clarified, glancing down at her phone. Poseidon nodded darkly. "Yes, I did not know any of them had been taken until this morning. Powerful spell work was cast over my daughter's homes. It sent replies to messages insisting everything was going fine, and cut off their ability to contact the outside world or leave the city. They also cut off contact with Olympus, something we didn't realize until early this morning when Hermes arrived. Yesterday, something akin to a prophecy was unveiled, and Percy could not contact any of Atlantis, so he attempted to travel to me and figure out what was going on. He never arrived, and the camp has not heard from him. We have since been able to confirm he too has been taken." Poseidon summarized, looking furious. Paul looked back and forth between them before beating Sally to the burning question that had arisen. "Then how did Percy just text us?" Paul asked quietly, looking down at Sally's phone. Poseidon's face twisted to one of surprise, reaching out, taking the phone. Sally offered to him. He read the text a few times, now looking puzzled. "It appears somewhat similar to the auto-replies Hermes stated the spellwork would send out when anyone was contacted underwater. It is how Xanth and Kim were taken without my notice. Annabeth received one last night from him, stating he was safe and with me, which was not the case. However, now I was assured that those spells are completely removed, so I'm unsure who would send this unless it was intentional," the Lord of the Seas said, voice barely disguising rage. He handed the phone back to her. "Someone took my son and sent that on purpose?" Sally hissed angrily, eyes blazing into Poseidon. "I believe it was meant for me, though I don't yet understand why," the sea god said, frustration evident in his tone. He ran his hand across his head, looking down at the floor. 3 of my children, 3, taken, and I haven't a clue where they are. I have so much power at my disposal, and yet now I am completely useless," Poseidon growled, looking as though he wanted to disintegrate something. Sally paused at that, looking over at Paul. A cold feeling washed over her. The father of her son didn't know how to find him. She knew of Odysseus, of Poseidon's rage over Polyphemus. She had read countless myths depicting Poseidon doing everything in his power to protect his children. He had told her once of his family, of his children, long past in that summer they had spent together. When she discovered she was pregnant, she couldn't help but be thankful her son's father would do everything he could to protect him. For him to be unable to find not 1, but 3 of his children, she knew he would be in agony. Even when Percy was young and Poseidon was forced to stay away to avoid attention from his brothers, she found evidence that he had come to visit Percy while she slept. She'd find her son content, cuddling some sort of small toy or new figurine on his dresser. She didn't ever know exactly where they came from, but she had a feeling it was Poseidon checking in on their son, even when it was dangerous for them both. "You'll find them, all of them, and you'll bring each of them home," Sally said, voice firm. Poseidon looking up at her with an unknown expression, guilt and sorrow prominent in his gaze. "I will. I won't rest until each of them is back in my arms." Poseidon swore. "Good. Bring our son home, Poseidon, and his sisters," Sally said. She knew that Percy's older siblings had become a positive impact on him, allowing Percy to finally experience some semblance of normality in his entirely abnormal life. The past few years had been a blessing, and all she wanted was for all of Poseidon's children to be back where they belonged, getting into normal trouble like throwing parties with their younger brother. "It does bring me a small amount of comfort that they are likely to be together. I know they will protect each other until I can reach them," Poseidon said softly, eyebrows coming together to form a worried line. "Percy's enjoying having them around, and having you around," Sally replied, glancing over at Paul, who nodded. "And his siblings have enjoyed getting to know him. Xanth and Rhoda in particular seem especially fond," Poseidon said, a hint of amusement breaking through his voice as the god let out a small smile. They sat in silence for a beat before Paul softly cleared his throat, glancing over at the god of the seas. By the way, I couldn't help but notice that our entire house was shaking this morning, except for Estelle's room. Should we be concerned about that? Sally's husband asked, glancing toward the playpen where the toddler babbled, watching Dora with a squeal of delight. Poseidon turned to look as well, a warm expression breaking out over the god's face, as he stood and walked over to Estelle. Sally followed him, knowing Poseidon would not injure her daughter. Estelle looked up and babbled, grinning up at the god, who reached down and picked her up, placing her gently on his hip. It made Sally's heart clench. She had only ever seen Poseidon hold Percy once, the day he was born. The god had come to meet his son and wish them both a final farewell. His presence was already attracting more attention to her than originally anticipated. The god of the sea smiled at her daughter, placing 2 fingers on her forehead, and the toddler let out a loud laugh as a small flash of light flickered outwards from her. "What was that?" Paul asked quickly, glancing down at the grinning daughter. Poseidon handed Estelle gently to Paul with another smile as the toddler patted his face. "It appears some of my children have paid her visit. She is quite protected from aspects of my realm. She also cannot drown, and no boat she is on will ever experience rough seas." The god of the seas rumbled, a look of deep fondness on his face. Sally's eyes widened as she walked over, brushing Estelle's hair back with a shocked expression. Paul looked down at her child's face, expression stunned. "Thank them for me," Sally said in awe, glancing back up towards her son's father. Poseidon nodded warmly to her before his expression once more turned grim. "I must return and check on my other children. Amphitrite is watching over them for the time being, but they have been outside of my sight long enough that I wish to see them myself. I have had news. If I have news, I will send word or come myself if I am able. In the meantime, I wish to see you both protected. If this is truly someone targeting me or my family, they may see you or your daughter as leverage, as it is apparent to anyone in my world that the royal family favors that child." Poseidon explained, waving his hand behind him. Suddenly, 2 men appeared in the hallway behind her, something slightly inhuman about them despite being in mortal form. They were tall and tanned, dark hair and sharp features, both dressed in celestial bronze armor with swords holstered by their sides. They bowed to the god of the seas before standing upright, like they were waiting for orders. Paul jumped when they appeared, Sally looking over at them before Poseidon continued. "These are 2 of my most loyal guards, Hunts and Margialis. They have served me and my family well for many years. If you would allow them, I would like for them to stay and protect you," Poseidon said, glancing back toward Sally. "You really think someone would come after us?" she asked quietly. Poseidon's expression darkened, shaking his head. "At this point, I don't know what to think. What I do know is our son will want you 2 and his little sister protected if something were to happen," the Lord of the Seas replied gravely. Sally finally nodded. Poseidon gestured to her as he turned back to face the 2 guards. "This is Sally Jackson Blowfizz and her husband Paul Blowfizz, Prince Perseus' mother and stepfather, as well as their daughter Estelle. Guard them with your life," Poseidon ordered. The 2 guards saluted to him. "Yes, sire," they both replied. They announced they were going to secure the perimeter and swiftly pulled open the front door and stepped outside. "If you find anything, you let me know as soon as you do." Sally said firmly to the Lord of the Seas, who nodded at her in return. "I will," the god of the sea replied, disappearing into a spray of sea mist. The guards returned a few moments later as Sally settled Estelle back into the playpen. Desperate to take a moment and process, the guards glanced at each other as she stood up before one, Margialis, if Sally recalled correctly, opened his mouth to speak. "The perimeter is secure, my lady. If you and your husband need a moment, we would be able to watch over the princess," the guard said slowly, trailing off before deciding on what to refer to Estelle as. Sally shook her head. "She's not your king's child," Sally said weakly, glancing down at her daughter. The guard nodded at her. "I know, but she is our prince's sister. It seems like the most appropriate title to offer her," Margialis stated, glancing over at Paul, who had a stunned expression. "Are you comfortable watching a mortal child?" Sally asked slowly. The guard smiled softly at her, nodding. "I am a father myself, my lady, and I have been with the royal family for thousands of years. I was present for 3 of the royal family's births, and even Lady Xanth was brought to the palace in her youth, though I am unsure if she remembers much of that now," Margialis explains. Sally nodded back in response. "I'll be back in a moment," Sally finally said, turning and walking back towards her bedroom, finally letting a few tears fall. It appeared Paul agreed the guards could handle their toddler for a few moments while Sally collected herself. Paul pulled her into a hug as she let herself cry, finally feeling her strength leave her. She almost cursed the gods. They had better find a way to bring her son home to her, or she would outright march on Olympus herself. And that is the end of chapter 12. I hope you all enjoyed. Oh my god. Freaking volleyball season is finally over. And I am so happy about it. Because if we had won on Thursday, we could have gone to state. But it's really nice not having to practice or do games. I get to just go home after school and not worry about anything. Score! And I'm not doing basketball. I technically agreed. I agreed that I would do basketball this year. Like, I said, like, I'm 100%, I'm doing it. And then I hardcore backtracked, so I'm not doing it anymore. And, like, nobody can force me to. So yeah, I'm not doing basketball. It's not happening. It's not fucking happening. No way. And I am gonna do track in the spring, but, you know. And, like, basically, I'm doing a lot of shit, and I'm really glad that volleyball is finally over. I'm still gonna have to go to all the home basketball games anyway. I mean, I play in the pep band. Oh, and tomorrow we have a Veterans Day assembly, and I play trumpet. So, I get to be the one of the special people who does the taps. It's called taps. It's basically the bum 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 bum. Yeah, that thing. I do that. But we are playing the incorrect version because our teacher thinks it's cooler. Yeah. So we're playing the incorrect version. And so I'm playing the main part of it, and our other trumpet person is playing the echo part of it because it's echo taps. And echo taps has not been correct since like the 1930s. Yay. Or was it 60s? Something like that. It's been since the 1900s. So I hope it doesn't offend anyone. That's my main point. I hope it doesn't offend anyone because it's fun to play. I really hope nobody gets offended. And we're also gonna do, like, Star Spangled Banner, obviously, and then, American Parade, and just, you know, stuff like that, and I think it'll be fun. I'm gonna wear my concert black with red earrings. I have a white headband right here, and I'm gonna try and find something that's blue, so I can have one accessory that's everything. I can have at least one accessory for everything. I have a lot of purple stuff, which doesn't help. God, I might have blue ribbon. I might have blue ribbon or something that I could, like, wrap around my waist. Anyway, I think that's it. I'm done with my rambling. I hope you all enjoyed. Oh, dude, there was ancient Greek in this. And what I do for the ancient Greek is I take it, or for the Greek, I take it, I pause the video, I copy it down, I paste it into Google Translate, and then I listen to the audio part that it has for pronunciation. And I do that until I can confidently say it without listening to it. And then I come back and I fuck it up. I come back here, I unpause the video, I just say it, and most of the time I fuck it up. So it's not very good, but I did my best with what I have because I do this all in one take. I don't know how to edit. I do not know how to edit stuff. I have literally never edited a video besides merging two videos. So yeah. And so it's shit. Basically, it's shit. And that's why you can hear me, like, stuttering and stuff. So, like, studying and doing pronunciations wrong and, like, doing wrong voices for characters because I do this all in one take. There is no editing. There is no cutting out. There is no redoing. I do it all and it's out there. As soon as it's said, it's said. There's no going back. That's how I do it. And it's not very good, but it's what I got. So, yeah. I'm honestly surprised as many people like my shit as they do. It's shit. It really is shit. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all have a good night or day wherever you are. And